You're listening to Parasearch Radio, news, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio. Parasearch Radio, broadcasting to the UK and beyond.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Haunted Histories with your host Penny G. Morgan, right here on Parasearch Radio.
And a very good Wednesday evening to you all. Here we are again, refreshed and ready to go for another episode of Haunted Histories with your host, Penny G. Morgan, here only on Parasearch Radio, the place for all things paranormal and potentially unexplainable. You may or may not be aware, but I've been absent for the last few weeks on my summer holidays, but with the help of my fellow Parasearch colleagues, well, Kerry G mainly, the shows were still broadcast, which I recorded before I flew to Spain. If you haven't had a chance to listen to them yet, fret not. You can still access them on our Spreaker page and listen to me talk with Dee Mason of Goth Angel Productions about Coventry's air attacks during World War II and also its history as a watchmaker. And also the absolutely brilliant Simon Entwistle, a top storyteller, that gentleman, of Top Hat Tours, when he takes us on a trip around Lancashire talking about the Pendle Witches. Absolutely fascinating, not to be missed. I'm not joking when I say that if you haven't had a listen to those two, you are definitely losing out on something. Both are incredibly knowledgeable and very experienced guests who had so much information to pass on to us. But as I say, I've just got back from 2 weeks in Spain, and I'm not quite sure what's happening with the weather down south, because it's more like October really out there, so I was hoping I'd bring back some of the Spanish sunshine. I'm sure they had enough to spare with the heat waves going on over there. But tonight we're going to be joined by good friends of Haunted Histories, Stuart and Rosie Dawson of Simply Ghost Nights, to talk about the both beautiful and slightly imposing St Catherine's Hospital in Doncaster. If you remember, Rosie and Stuart were on earlier this year when we looked at the amazing Ripon Workhouse. Unfortunately, we had a little bit of a technical glitch with that show, so I'm really hoping it goes smoothly for us this time, as the two of them, not only are they absolutely adorable people, they also have so many tales and experiences to share that we really want to make the most of it. But back to St Catherine's. Well, when I decided to cover there, I thought about what I could talk through from a history perspective. There's quite a few areas that apply to St Catherine's, as it wasn't actually built as a hospital, but as a private sort of getaway holiday residence for the Banks family. George Banks, the wool merchant, believe he was based in Leeds normally. But not George Banks, the character in Mary Poppins, and certainly not George Banks, the very scary American serial killer. Well, George Banks, the wool merchant, had this beautiful property built in the mid-1800s, and it passed down through his family until it was sold off in 1928. And then in 1930, when the South Yorkshire Hospital Board acquired it and began its metamorphosis into a hospital. The hospital itself had quite a few uses and wasn't just an asylum, but also had children's wards to deal with childhood illnesses that were rife at that time, such as diphtheria, polio, and it also had sanatoriums for long-term diseases such as tuberculosis. It also had a unit specifically for female chest complaints. I kid you not, that's what it says. So, it led me to think, well, obviously medicine was going to be a no-brainer, but what part of medicine could we look at that we hadn't chatted about, or that we could quite easily fill a 30 minute slot and make interesting, but also informative? So I racked my brains, looked at all my books that I own and everything else, and I thought we could look at the history, a very brief history, of the asylum and mental health in the UK. I do want to issue a very strong caveat though. Please, please do not be offended by some of the terminology that may be used when looking at this. There are descriptions and phases that are, to be honest, quite abhorrent to us now, but 100 years ago or 100 years plus, they were commonplace and very much acceptable and allowed. Hopefully you will see how the treatment of mental health issues has advanced a long way, although arguably still has a very, very long way to go. So, the level of specialist psychiatric care in both the 18th and 19th centuries was very limited due to, if I'm honest, very little being known about it. It was seen as a physical problem rather than a psychological one. At the start of the 19th century, there was an estimated just a few thousand what they would call lunatics in various asylums across England, which rapidly grew to over 100,000 at the start of the 20th century. This started the rise in the sort of Victorian-esque asylums that are still dotted around the country, albeit not used as such, being built. In today's society, asylums aren't used. Most of you probably remember the whole care in the community thing starting back in the 1980s. A lot of these buildings stand derelict. Some have been converted into flats or even bulldozed for new houses, leaving behind only memories and untold stories. Diverting slightly from the subject, some of the developments of these properties has been quite sympathetic. There was a very big one down in Chartham in Kent. I think it was one of the biggest hospitals in the southeast, and certain parts of its original features has been retained, although the many acre site, a lot of it has been bulldozed and brand new properties built, but you can still see what would have been the old water towers, which most asylums had. Well, pretty much all of them had these giant water towers, which is a way of recognising that there may have been an asylum there at one point. Anyway, I digress. The fact that mental health and psychiatric care and all those kind of things is actually still a very young branch of medicine, it's probably why the differences in treatments from the 1800s and before, to be honest, differ so greatly to now, although parts of it are still used. Before the later 1800s, when the plethora of asylums was built, there was a very well known and well documented what they called trade in lunacy, as it was known. This would be where people could pay to go and observe the poor unfortunates who were hospitalised. I use that word in the broadest sense, in these places. Probably, in all honesty, it's more akin to a zoo than a medical facility. This is one of the reasons that the Bethlehem Hospital, or Bedlam as it was known, has so much notoriety, as it was infamous for this practice. Although, from a business point of view, however cruel we think this to be, it was actually a way, and also a way to raise funds for these places, as this was well before the days of the NHS, and most medical professionals did not see mental illness as something or anything more than a physical manifestation of something supernatural. In fact, some countries are still battling against this and believe mental breakdowns and the like are due to impure thoughts or demonic possession. In fact, in India, I was reading on the internet, there's a big movement to try and stop local villagers thinking like this. Quite scary, really. The theories of the four humours, which is one of the old sort of methods applied probably pre the mid-1800s, the four humours being black bile, yellow bile, phlegm and blood, were applied, sometimes separately and sometimes combined with the theory of evil spirits, which would have been a matter of faith. Someone called Arnaldus de Villanova, who was around from 1235 to 1313, combined evil spirit and Galen-orientated for humours theories and promoted trepanning as a cure to let demons and excess humours escape, basically drilling holes in people's skulls. Other bodily remedies in general use would have included things such as purges, bloodletting, and even whipping to get these evil spirits out. Madness was seen as a moral issue, either as a punishment for sin or a test of faith and character. Christian theology endorsed various therapies, including fasting and prayer for those estranged from God, and exorcism of those possessed by the devil. Thus, although mental disorder was often thought to be due to sin, other more mundane causes were also explored, including bad diet, overuse of alcohol, overwork, and grief. In fact, the term lunatic was applied to those with periods of mental disorder, deriving from either, they believe, the Roman mythology describing people moonstruck by the goddess Luna, or theories of an influence by the moon, hence the lunar part of lunatic. Before the rise of hospitals, individuals would have been looked after by their family members, and you can almost understand where the whole sort of bad sort of feelings about mental health has come from. If people still believe it, sort of deep down, even if they don't realise it, that mental health problems were actually due to the person committing sin or possibly being possessed by a demon, whether you believe in demons or not. Another highly popular fashion in the 1800s, when these particularly archaic methods of treatment waned, so there's trepanning and bloodletting and whipping and all those kind of things, was that of phrenology, which claimed to identify temperamental characteristics such as aggression or lust by means of lumps and bumps on the individual's skull and facial physiognomy. I can't pronounce the words today, I'm so sorry. Can you imagine what those Victorian scientists would have found if they examined the bumps and stuff of those people who've been in Love Island recently? They'd probably have a field day, all that lust. Psychology itself retained largely traditional concepts such as melancholic and choleric tendencies, but in 1846 the term psychiatry was coined to denote medical treatment of disabling mental conditions, which were generally held to actually have hereditary causes. Whole nature versus nurture, I guess. The Victorian period witnessed an impressive growth in the classification and isolation, or strictly speaking, the concentration of the insane and mentally impaired in large, very strictly regulated lunatic asylums outside major cities, where women and men were legally incarcerated, largely and usually for life. Opened in 1851, the Coney Hatch Asylum in Middlesex, for example, housed over 1,200 patients. But wealthier families made use of private care in much smaller and less crowded establishments. Two major figures, if you're interested and you want to look it up, in the Victorian mental health field were James Connolly, who was the author of a book, The Construction and Government of Lunatic Asylums, in 1847, and a Henry Maudsley, whose books include things like The Physiology and Pathology of Mind, in 1867. I won't go into any of their technical information as it's not really appropriate for a 30-minute history brief, but they're there if you want them, and if you do fancy looking them up. What I find very interesting, though, is to note that the actual number of asylums in Britain during Queen Victoria's reign, so that would have been from 1837 to 1901, grew rapidly in the 50 years prior to 1909. The population itself doubled, but the number of people in these institutions, and by institution I do actually include things like workhouses as well as asylums, as there were a high number of people with mental health problems in workhouses, as you probably remember from previous talks that I have done on them. They couldn't work, they may not have been able to get classified as being poorly, or their family, they may not have family to have put them into the asylum, so they admitted themselves to the workhouses. But the number of people in these institutions quadrupled. Yes, it quadrupled. So whilst the population only doubled, the amount of people in some form of institution quadrupled. Quite frightening, really. But what were people being admitted with, and what was life like in the asylum? Is our fascination with them no better than those people who paid to view the patients at Bedlam all those years ago? Or do we have a more benevolent reason for wanting to read about these places and possibly investigate them on a paranormal basis? It's a good question, really, isn't it? Are we just sort of, I don't know, revelling in the fact that we're not going through it? Or is it a sympathetic and, like I say, benevolent thing? It's up to you to answer that question, because I don't know what everyone thinks, but I don't know, really. Maybe it's just an empathy point of view for some people. They want to be able to communicate with some of these spirits that are locked in these places. But we'll talk about that later on. Anyway, so the reasons for admittance was set out in Actual Asylums' annual reports, and you can actually get these in sort of records offices and everything else. But some of the reasons would include things such as stress, physical trauma, and childbearing strains, probably postnatal depression as we would know it now. But others were not so definable. Eccentricity, for example, was sometimes down as a reason. Others might be down as melancholia or mania. But don't forget, some women, and it was women, may be put into the asylum by their family or husband on some ridiculous reason. I remember a friend telling me about someone she knew who'd got pregnant at 16 in the 1940s. Her family was so devastated that they got her admitted into an asylum for life. She was let out in her 70s once the asylum closed down, but had become what they led her to believe she was, and subsequently needed constant care. In other words, she had no mental health problems when she went in at 16, but being in that kind of environment for sort of 50-odd years had caused her to develop them. They even admitted people who we would not class as needing mental health care, such as those suffering from epilepsy and what they called an imbecile, which would just be someone now with learning difficulties. Like I say, please don't be offended at some of the terminology. This is true terminology from hundreds of years ago. Now, interestingly enough, the actual living conditions and food, so they had hot running water, they had clean cold water, they had sanitation, were probably better than that of the average working home, as doctors believed that insanity could be fixed by good food and clean air. This actual apparent luxury was often tempered by the actual regimes which people had to follow, which would include patients sleeping in close proximity to others, up to sometimes 50 in a ward, minimal privacy, communal eating, communal sleeping, and an incredibly strict daily regime. The staff also were of differing levels of both competence and temperament, so it's pretty quite safe to assume that some patients were not dealt with maybe compassionately or respectfully. But although that is conjecture on my part, you can find true counts of asylums which were shut down due to the disgusting treatment of the patients that were in there and the ineffectiveness of the staff. One of the things that we possibly associate with asylums are the stories of the types of treatment used. In the early 1900s, the rise of the use of electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, and lobotomies. Whilst these types of treatment probably did help some, they also irreparably damaged others who would never recover. And whilst these were most likely offered by medical staff as innovationary treatments to help patients, the sheer aggressive nature of them would not have helped people view asylums as anything but a place of last resort and intimidation, as opposed to healing and safe. Things like these are still used in modern medicine, but not quite to the level that possibly they were back then. Those treatments, whilst continuing, had others added to them, such as insulin therapy. Now this one I actually found quite shocking, and there was a case of a very famous actress who was admitted into an asylum in the 50s who had this type of treatment applied to her. I won't say her name because, well, if you want to find out you can Google it, but it's true. Now, in a nutshell, insulin therapy. They would give the patient insulin so that they fell asleep. Now, if you don't know what insulin does, it basically reduces your sugar levels. It's what diabetics use to maintain their sugar levels, as their pancreas doesn't produce it naturally. Also, if you give someone too much insulin or someone's sugar levels drop, they get dozy. They fall asleep. Well, in actual fact, they're pretty much comatose. The staff would then wake these people up to feed them, and then the patient would go back to sleep again. Absolutely amazing when you think about it. That basically just is like an extreme and possibly quite dangerous form of sedation. Because I know from having had experience of diabetics, monitoring and maintaining balanced sugar levels, is incredibly important to the health of the body. So what this treatment might have done to people who are on it long term, I hate to think. Whilst doing my research for this show, and there were so many other things I could have included that I've left out because I have a feeling we might come back to the whole asylum and mental health horrors, for some people anyway, I found some accounts of people who were in the asylums in the second half of the 20th century. Some of their stories, well, they were actually quite tragic, but they do reinforce a lot of the information that I've given you so far. For example, it's a lady by the name of Edna Martin, and 20 years of hell was what she remembers of asylums. She was born in 1923 in the Crumpsall Institution, a former workhouse, and brought up by her grandfather, a Salford alderman. When she was 9, she worked out that the woman who occasionally came to clean her granddad's pub was actually her mum. Her grandfather had had his daughter locked up in a mental hospital for having 2 children out of wedlock. See, I told you it happened. Her older brother took her to see the woman they called Emily. Edna said, "Hello, Mum," and she broke down. They both cried. She had a teddy bear for her. One of Emily's sisters eventually got her out of the hospital, but she never lived with her children. At the age of 15, Edna met this man and she went to his house. It wasn't abusive, she says, because he showed her affection, and no one had ever shown her that before. But her grandfather saw them going into the pictures together and called the police. They said, "Did I have intercourse?" And I said, "What's that?" Nobody talked about it. I had no idea what they meant. On the Monday, she was taken to juvenile court, and they asked her granddad, did he want her home? He answered, "No, send her away. Shut her away for the rest of her life. I never want to see her again." And he didn't. Interesting to note, though, that Edna's boyfriend was actually 62 and married and committed suicide before his scheduled appearance at the Assizes Court a couple of months later. So Edna was taken to the Parkside Approved School, and she played up because she didn't think she should be there. So before her 18th birthday, they brought in a psychiatrist who diagnosed her as being an imbecile, a mental defective and feeble-minded, and she was transferred to Calderstones, which ironically was where her mum had been. She thought to herself, she says, I'm not those things, and she retaliated against everyone, doctors, staff, everybody. So she got put into a side ward and doped up. They gave her paraldehyde to sleep at night, but it was for punishment. It was the needle. She was put into a dormitory with women who were getting into bed with each other. She didn't know what they were doing, so she asked. And when she found out, she told the staff she didn't want to stay there, but they said she had to. So she smashed the window of a sewing room with her fist. She was put in a straitjacket on the isolation ward. She was naked underneath. And they kicked the chamber pots into you, and you had to manage as best as you could. The windows were shuttered, so it was constantly dark. They also kicked in your food on a tin plate, and you had to eat it off the floor. They used enemas for punishment. She said she was once sitting with her legs up under me, and a nurse pulled the chair out from underneath, so she fell on the floor. I asked her why she'd done that, and she marched me to the bathroom. How horrific. Edna did actually get out of the asylum in the late 1950s when the 1950 Mental Health Act ended certification, and she was told she was free to leave. There is a lot more to Edna's story and many of the others that I found, which I'm not going to talk through because they're all quite tragic, to be quite honest. And whilst she wasn't actually ever a patient at St Catherine's Asylum or St Catherine's Mental Ward, which we're going to be talking about shortly, I'm sure there are actually many Ednas there in its history. And in fact, St Catherine's is still a mental health hospital, and there have been some quite tragic cases associated with it. Not tragic in the treatment of the patients, I hasten to add, but tragic in the stories that resulted in them being there. So now we are all thoroughly miserable. So I do like to cheer you up, don't I? It's a rainy, miserable day down south. Has been all day. I've got soaked more than once, and now I've talked about the horrors of mental health treatment in the 18th and 19th and early 20th century. Well, we're going to take a short break, and then we'll be talking with our friends, the Dawsons, and finding out what tales of St. Catherine's they have for us, and hopefully they'll cheer us up. Do stay tuned. Back shortly.
Hello, Harry Price here. Good evening. If there's nothing myself and everybody else enjoy here on the other side more is the sit back and relax and listen to Parasearch Radio with its paranormal news, views and reviews from across the UK and beyond. Make sure to find out more about them on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web, whatever they are, to keep up to date with all their broadcasts throughout the week. And I hope you enjoy them as much as we do over here. Hello? Is anybody there?
And we're back. Thank you very much for staying with us. I'm now joined by the lovely Rosie and Stuart Dawson from Simply Ghost Nights, who are actually talking to us from, well, nearly north of the England border. You're up in Northumberland, I believe.
That's right, we're in Berwick-upon-Tweed.
Oh, lovely up there. And there's sunbathing, would you believe it? If anyone, looked out the window earlier down south, where we're supposed to get the sun, it's black sky, grey skies and torrential rain. And they've just told me they've been sitting out in the sun watching the blue skies. So I'm jealous. I am jealous. But thank you guys for joining us to talk about St. Catherine's. I know you've said before this is quite a regular haunt, if you pardon the pun, for you guys, because it is just up the road from you. I mentioned in my bit about the history side as well that this place has had quite a lot of different uses, from being a residential home for the Banks, residential holiday home for the Banks family, to a hospital with mental health facilities there, children's facilities for things like diphtheria and polio, TB facilities, and it is still part of it, is still a mental health facility, yeah. I believe. I've never been, so do you want to talk about what the buildings are for me, so we can sort of set
yes,
the picture, if that's all right?
It's kind of in vast grounds, which was originally Doncaster's main mental health hospital, which right. It's basically constructed of about 10 buildings on the one ground. Mm-hmm. St. Catherine's Hall, what we use, is no longer used for the actual mental health wards or anything, but it's got a lot of function rooms there, and originally in its day it would have been used as, one of the main wards. Right. It is a really grand old building.
Yeah, I've seen the photos of it. It does look very, typically Victorian and imposing and beautiful all at the same time. Yeah. So you guys have done quite a lot of investigations there. One of the things I sort of mentioned when I was doing my little history bit earlier was I wondered whether it does seem to be there's a bit of, I don't know if infatuation is the right word, but paranormal investigators do seem to like asylums and former asylums. Whether this is down to all the television programs that have specialised in going into them, whether it's a slightly voyeuristic thing, almost like the old visits to people used to pay to go to what was Bedlam to see the patients, or if it is something more empathic, if it's more of a benevolent sort of wanting to be there to help people tell their story.
Yeah. I think it's down to the fact that a lot of the guests who come, they have this eerie misconception that, these people are tortured, these people are, feeling really down. It's got to have spirits that are trapped there. That, they think all the wrong things, really, because St. Catherine's was one of the hospitals which I believe actually treat them a lot better than a lot of the old mental hospitals. Yeah. And I don't think they're always as, they're not as grisly as what people expect them to be. Let's just say that. But I think people come because they think they will be.
Yeah, yeah. I agree with you there. I've not been able to find anything particularly negative about St. Catherine's when I was researching different asylums and their sort of stories. There were a few, though, that I found quite sort of dark tales about. And I don't actually think some of them it was so much the people were badly treated within them, but it was the reasons they were put in there that perhaps were bad.
Yes.
Some, that when you get the stories, and quite a few of them about young women who maybe were quite outgoing sexually, whereas
Hmm.
now you'd just be like, you'd shrug your shoulders and let them get on with it. Back then, parents, grandparents would ask for them to be institutionalized because they didn't know how to deal with it. And no, I think those kind of stories is a kind of it's bad treatment, but not on the part of the facility, but on the part of the family who sort of chucked them in there and forgot about them.
Yeah.
And on the same kind of vein as well, Penny, they used to do that with single mothers as well. Single
Yeah,
mums would be put into places like that
yeah,
as well.
yeah.
Yeah.
Workhouses and things like that was
Yeah.
quite common, wasn't it?
I
Yeah.
think it was kind of our dirty little secret. We'll wipe our hands of them,
Yeah,
won't it?
yeah,
I mean, then we don't have to worry about it.
But,
yeah,
women with postnatal depression and
yeah.
etc. Things like that, they were put into places like that.
Well, even people with epilepsy were. People
Yeah,
with
that's right.
epileptics were put into mental health facilities, and it does make you wonder if where the stigma that we still attach to mental health comes from all those years back, when people thought that if you had a mental health problem, it was either because you'd been sinning or you were possessed by the devil or a demon, and maybe that's where the whole stigma thing goes back to, because even though people don't realise that's what it is, it's like it's something you don't talk about, it's a dirty little secret sort of thing.
Yeah.
So tell us about St Catherine's. What sort of things? What are the rooms like? What do you see? Some of the
Well,
experiences that you've had there.
when you actually walk into the building, I mean, we last time we were there, we had a couple of customers came, and I don't know why they were expecting a derelict building,
Mhm.
which is it's complete opposite. It's actually done out very nice. It's been, refurbished to a beautiful standard.
Mm.
Each room's set up different for function rooms, so you could hire a function room for a day. Each one's completely different in colour, in style, etc. But on the events, obviously we get to use these rooms, and I can honestly say that there's none less active than another. They're all really active rooms. We really,
Right.
really have amazing times when we go to St. Cath's. Some of the stuff that I've experienced personally in my group alone, I've seen there's one particular room. I don't want to say which one it is. I don't want to jinx it for myself. But
Okay.
three separate times now I've gone to this location and this same room. If you've got the right group on the night, I've seen the table literally jump across the floor without anybody touching it. You have to build the atmosphere with the guests. Yeah, get the energies going. But once the energy starts and the equipment starts going off, etc., there's no stopping them.
Yeah.
We use one room for a welcome room, and we have crisps and chocolate in there at the back of the room.
Oh, you sold me. I'm coming. You have crisps and chocolate. I'm
Yeah,
there.
and we'll just call out to the spirits and say, go and help yourself to some chocolate and crisps. And on many occasions, you actually do hear the chocolate and crisps rustling.
Really?
It's honestly unbelievable place.
So do you think these are the spirits of maybe the mental health patients, or possibly the children that were?
We
Were
have a whole spectrum of spirits who communicate through there. To be honest with you, Penny, we've had the chefs, the cooks. Some occasions we've had some people who claim to work with the banks as family in the servants' quarter, in the cellars and places like that. We've had a few of the maintenance team who've worked there in the past come through. It's just a whole spectrum of all spirituals coming through, to be honest. And obviously we do have the patients as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I do think, a lot of my experiences do seem to come from the patients, if I'm honest. But I have had a few members of spirits who claim to be the Banks family. You never know whether to believe them, do you? You've only got their word for it, who they are.
Yeah.
Because I do think they do like to play tricks as well. I think they'll be anybody you want them to be, as long as you're talking to them.
Yeah.
When we've been there and we've been talking, and some people will say, "Oh no, I think this is a patient," and they'll agree to you. And then 5 minutes later, "No, I think this is someone from the Banks family," and then they'll agree with you there. So I don't believe you'll ever get to the bottom of who you're actually talking to be honest. But whoever we've talked to in the past, we have never had a negative energy there. We've always had really good fun.
Yeah. So you've never had any sort of particularly unnerving experiences there, or have any of your guests ever been a bit sort of, I want to get out, I don't like it?
I don't think we have. I think we've had them guests who arrived. They're on the. We might have had in the cellars, Stuart said, but personally, I can't remember anybody in any of my vigils. Sorry, there's a very loud aeroplane going up above me right now.
That sounds like
Sorry
a fast
about
jet.
that.
RAF jet?
It does sound like a jet. I've never actually had anybody feel the need to leave a vigil, but, we've had the odd guests who come and they are really, really shaking in the boots when they arrive. And then once it starts, they completely change. And, I didn't think it would be as much interesting fun as what it actually is.
Yeah.
But, Stuart, I think, did you say you've had someone leave from the cellars?
A couple in the cellars. There was in the little side room, what used to be the wine cellars there. And there were two of them gone on a lone vigil. And one of them said she had a hair pull. The other one was at the other side of the room. And as she started screaming, the other one said she felt something, she had like a coat, like a crisp packet kind of texture kind of thing. And it made that were being tapped as well. And they come out literally shaking. And also in what we call the red room as well, we had a group of young girls in there. And we're not going to go on the table. We're not going on the glass, they said. They went on the glass of the table, had a really good time. But what freaked them out was we used the spirit box, and two of the names were mentioned. We said, "Come on, say Jade," and it said Jade, and they were like, "No, I'm not putting radio on in car no more."
Yeah, I've had that happen with people when they've heard things mentioned on spirit boxes. Their eyes go like saucers, and they're like, "You're faking it. You're faking it." I was like, "How can I fake it?" Yeah,
it's not a two-way radio. I mean, one instance was this is a few years ago, was in the kitchens, and we're just talking as we're getting spirit box out and getting speakers connected, and like, who's come furthest? Just talking to guests. And one of the lads said, "Oh, I think we're called Michael. He'd come from London." So I put the spirit box on, got it scanning. And, eventually we got round to Michael and we said, "Come on, describe Michael in one word." London. And he literally, so we said, "Whoa, that obviously means the spirits we're communicating with." I think that was Betty. Betty, worked in the kitchen. That's where we always get Betty in that room. And we said, obviously she must have been listening for it to have said London. And he gobsmacked him, couldn't believe it. I think I spoke to him after the event and he said, it just blew me away saying London, because we were just talking about that moments earlier.
Brilliant. Well, you mentioned the Red Room, and I know when I sort of Googled some of the reports from the place, the Red Room's been mentioned a few times. Is it called the Red Room because it's red as a function room or something?
Yeah, basically, we call it, yeah.
It's the name we gave it because it's got a red carpet, red walls.
Well,
inventive. So do you know what Sorry.
Well, I would say with the books we've got on the building when we went there is when it was part of the mental health hospital, you just see pictures of the beds, the row of beds in the red room, and what we call the purple room, obviously because it was the purple room, and the welcome
I'm spotting
room.
A pattern here. I really am.
Yeah. It's easy. It's easy for us to remember. But that bed had all the beds. We've seen photos of the beds lined out, about 10, 12 beds to the room.
But the red room is one of our most popular rooms.
Yeah. Right. So what sort of, who tends to come through in the Red Room, or do you not have a specific? Because I remember when we were talking about Ripon, you said there's a couple of spirits that do come through almost every time you go there. And you mentioned about the little girl who was tapping on the coffin.
Yes,
outside.
And then Stan the vagrant.
That's it.
We get. I've had Andrew. I'm not saying it right. We've had Andrew make communication with us a few times at in the Red Room.
Yeah.
And like I say, Betty in the kitchen, that's come out probably about 5 or 6 times. I think we've been there probably 20 times plus. And
one of the popular ones for me, I've had James come through many a time, who claims that he did work for the Banks family, if I remember rightly. I'm not sure what he actually did for them, because he always seems, when he enters the room, it's like all the other spirits suddenly leave the room. So he's somebody very, in charge. It's like you always know when that spirit's entered the room, because everybody just seems to disappear spirit-wise.
All right. So he could have been the butler or...
Yeah. Yes, that's what something like that. Someone in the authority.
Have you ever looked into it? Have you ever sort of researched the Banks family to see if you can find any links?
We've tried, but
we have got a book what's been written about the Banks family, but I only had it a week and somebody borrowed it off me, and I'm still waiting for them to hand it back. So as soon as they
You
read
hate it when that happens.
Yeah.
As for trying to track down people who work there, we just need a dead end, really. There doesn't seem to be any kind of
records, there's no
records of it.
So when was it shut as a hospital type facility, that part of the building?
I believe it was about, it was, do you know, I can't remember when it shut as an actual hospital.
I think it was in the 80s.
But because
90s,
it's always, even up to me being a teenager, even up to about 20 years ago, for people of Doncaster, they've always called it, the old mental hospital, which up until recently was, even then, still the old mental hospital.
So
and because
it's probably the care in the community thing, it's shut down on around
But
then.
I would say probably about the 80s when it changed into more of a function area.
Yeah. So, you say there's not been you've not had any unnerving experiences. You mentioned the cellars, but sometimes with cellars, I mean, people automatically get unnerved when they're down in a cellar anyway. So,
we have had equipment going off in the cellars, what we can't explain.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? REM pods and things, and door alarms, and we have various little pieces of equipment, including dolls and teddy bears, what all light up like REM pods and K2 meters. They all go off down in the cellars. And you could say, well, there might be electrical things down there, and there are. But we change the areas where we put them. So they go off at different times when things do, if someone's in a particular area on their own on a lone vigil, and the wine cellar, there's nothing in there electrical wise, but the equipment still goes off.
Oh, I'm not saying that there's not spirits down there, because it would be quite logical in a cellar. Because say the handyman of the hospital or something would have been down there normally, and if there was a wine cellar down there, well, you probably find whoever was in charge of the wine, it could even have been James the butler. He would have been quite protective over people accessing the wine cellar. So it's very logical there's people, it's down there. But I do seem to find that when you go underground, people automatically get more scared. And they tend to sort of they tend to not be as relaxed and receptive as when they're in a room they feel more comfortable in. Does that make sense? I know what I'm trying to say, even though it's a bit not very well.
It's dark. I mean, to be honest, most of our events, vigils are done in dark anyway. But a little bit of a light on when guests are on Ouija boards, can we see where the glass is going and what's it spelling? But one instance, I remember in what we class as the welcome room, we had a door alarm went off. And at the same time, one of the REM pods went off as well. And the REM pods very rarely go off anyway, to be quite honest, unless something's particularly really close to them.
Yeah.
But if I'm honest, the whole building seems to be active, doesn't it? All the vigil areas.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, it does sound it. It definitely does sound it. But like you say, it's got so many different energies now attaching to it. It's not just been one thing for its whole life. And from the reports I read, the Banks family did love it as a place to visit. So it's not, it wouldn't be hard to imagine them wanting to go back there as a happy place. And if people who were hospitalised there did feel comfortable there, they might want to go back because they were happy and they were well fed and they had hot running water and regular baths and all those kind of things. And
well looked after as well.
Exactly, had better living conditions than they would have had in an average worker's home. What's been your favourite experiences there?
Mine would have to be the vigil in the welcome room where the table was literally jumping across the floor, because we did have a non-believer in the group. And the table, we don't put all our effort into table tipping, but we do try to incorporate a little bit of table tipping for the guests. And this particular vigil, it started table tipping, and the non-believer were like, well, it might be one of us inadvertently pushing it. So he says, well, okay, what we'll do then, everybody put your feet on top of each other. So we're sat round in a big circle, about two foot back away from the table. Everybody put their toes on top of each other's toes, and everybody held hands. So everybody was completely accounted for. And we were calling out, and the table was literally jumping from one person to another when they were calling out, bring the table to me. And the table would jump to them. and this person was absolutely gobsmacked, couldn't believe it. You know, that's the kind of thing I've witnessed about 4 times in all my time of doing this, 12 years, and I've seen it happen about 4 times. And it's when you've got a non-believer in the group, you just think, get in, thank you, spirits.
Yeah, yeah. I must admit, with table tipping, I like to stand back and watch it, as opposed to be in it. I think I unnerve other groups. I think they think I'm watching what they're doing, but I don't. I just like observing it as opposed to sort of being in it. But that's just me. Everyone's different. But yeah, when you get an experience like that with a non-believer and something happens and you see their whole face change and they suddenly realise that the beliefs they've held for so long, they might have to reevaluate them.
They have to grovel to the wife for calling them wasting the money all the time. You know, it's like, all night you'll get, what a waste of money. Like, friggin' hell, I can't understand how that happened.
Well, I was on one. It was a fort in Kent, and there was this young couple were there, and he was quite tall, looked military-ish. He wasn't, but he had the sort of militaries. They were in very early 20s, if anything. And he had only come along to keep her company because she didn't want to come on her own, and he was sort of a bit kind of, yeah, prove it, blah blah blah. Well, I went off on, I was a bit bored with what the medium was doing, if I'm completely honest, and I sort of said to him, can I go and investigate that little room where that man's meant to persecute any women who go in it? It was like somebody who used to work, one of the soldiers who used to work in the fort didn't like women in his space, and when I know that there's something around me, I get the shakes quite badly, and I can't stop it. It's not fabricated. Anyway, I walked in there, and this guy's going, there's something in here, and all you could smell was like sweat and oil. That's the only way I can describe it. It was a really weird smell. And then the temperature started fluctuating massively, and he's standing next to me, and I've got my temperature sort of gun thing out. And then I start sort of chiding because I could feel something touching my hand, and I start sort of, I got really argumentative with the spirit, and I don't normally get like that. There was something doing it anyway. And he started to see me shaking and going sort of very pale, and he was like, "You're right, you're right." I said, "Yeah, this is just what happens." And he was kind of when he left because they did a sort of a, I don't know if they did a séance that lot because I was doing something else, but after that, he was like, when are we coming to another one, to his girlfriend? It's brilliant. It's true, isn't it? It's real. And he was the one for about the first hour was like, yeah, about it all. So, yeah, it's quite a nice... I like seeing people's minds get changed, or at least opened to the possibilities of things.
I must admit, it's the best part of the job when you know you've witnessed something that night and you have changed a non-believer's opinion.
Yeah, yeah. So, Stuart, what's been your favourite experience there?
The one I mentioned about when it said London and Michael, that one stuck in my head. Yeah. And then a vigil in I think it was the welcome room. We had 2 K2s on a table, and we had one on the left for yes and one on the right for no. Yeah. And the guests were just throwing questions out there, and the K2 was literally responding yes and no between the 2 K2s. So they got a bit of communication that way. I've seen it a few times, Newcastle Keep many years ago, but it doesn't happen very often.
No,
and the way we're doing that, Penny, it was like they were specifically asking the names. So, they're saying, I'm Lisa, can you light up the right one for me? And the right one would light up. Yeah. My name's Sarah, could you light the left one up? The no. Oh yeah, and it would just wait, we're doing it fantastic.
Yeah, it was an intelligent response.
It really was, yeah. It really was.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. That sort of thing doesn't. I mean, you watch your sort of your ghost adventures, your paranormal lockdowns, all those kind of things. It seems to happen every single time. But what they don't realise is that's like 20 odd hours worth of footage to get those 5 minutes of it working. So when it does actually, it's like when you use flashlights to get them to blip on and off for yes or no. Yeah. I mean, that to me blows my mind when it's happened. It doesn't happen that often, but it absolutely blows my mind when it does. Or, so you use the K2s there, you use the spirit boxes, your table tipping, Ouijas. Any other types of equipment that you like to use at St. Cath's?
REM pods. We use, the various equipment like the Boo Buddies, the bears. We've got 3 of them kicking around. We've got Polyver Dollies, which are basically a K2 in a doll, but a bit slightly more advanced than that. Just so if we have children, we find children want to communicate. Yeah. We have night vision, door alarms, window alarms that we use on doors, sound enhancers. Really good tales about using the sound enhancers. They pick up 50 times more than what your hearing does.
Well, is that like parabolic mics and that kind of thing?
Very similar, yeah, very similar actually, yeah. And we've had, honestly, no end of people, guests say, "Oh, I've just heard this. I've heard my name called. I've heard something over the other side of the room."
Yeah.
I mean, the best one I think I probably told you was the Ripon. We were using a glass up at Ripon Workhouse, and the guests ran the glass, and they said, one of them said, "Do you like us being here?" And the glass went to no, and at the same time, the woman with the sound enhancers said, "I've just heard, go away, go away." So I rewound it. So as we thought, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Just kind of stuff like that. I'm trying to think of equipment. Obviously, we go spiritual side with the divination rods and the crystals.
Do you ever do seances there?
Yeah.
Anything interesting come up from those? But seeing as it's got a Victorian background to it, and obviously the Victorians loved their seances.
Well, yeah, we do the Victorian seances, the tapping and the rappings, and then move on to hopefully a bit of table tipping if it'll move, or hopefully shake and vibrate and things like that. But yeah, we do the whole lot. Basically, I don't think there's much we miss out on really.
So it's to keep it varied. It's to use lots of different techniques and give everyone the chance to experience. Give the investigators who are there the chance to experience all these different techniques.
I mean, we go as far as we have. We'll blindfold guests if they want to do a lone vigil. Try and get the heighten the senses a bit more. See, try different varieties. I mean, we even have we'll take crucifixes and draw around them, trigger objects and the like. Yeah, the kit we have, I'll be honest, is phenomenal, but we leave a lot at home as well, don't we? We also take CCTV camera, camcorders, infrared lights on, so if guests want to do that.
Have you ever tried taking a straitjacket in there?
What we do though, I'll be honest, if we go to some places, if you go to the halls or places, or even the army, the army or the RAF bases, we'll record some kind of music from the time, whether it be Glenn Miller or that kind of ilk, and see if that gets the spirits heightened.
I've recorded aircraft noises from aircraft that would have been based there. Like I've
really?
Yeah, and I've had stuff happen with that, like an aircraft in trouble, the sound of an engine of an aircraft either coming in to land or in trouble, and that seems to get the things sort of galvanised. Whether it, but yeah, I just thought straitjacket somewhere like that might
Yeah. Downstairs in cellars, there is two tables that they would have used when it was an institute. I can remember Doncaster Air Museum, going off key slightly. Guests with sound enhancers, I think it was in Hangar 21, claimed that they heard a tower, the airplane tower, like communication between that and the plane.
Oh.
But I didn't have the sound enhancers, and so I couldn't say yes or no.
Aircraft and stuff is one of my, especially World War II, sort of pre-1950s aircraft is one of my many hobbies of following and stuff. So I love my World War II type airfields, and I do seem to get attached to, not in a bad way, I mean, but I seem to attract energy. Anything to do with an airfield seems to be, it goes a bit potty. But
we'd like Doncaster Air Museum. That's quite phenomenal for activity there as well. That one.
Was that an old RAF base then?
It was, yeah. I think it was. Was it bomber? Alan. We've done it a few times, haven't we?
I'll look that one up. I know that where I sort of grew up in Norfolk was predominantly bomber, World War II American and bombers, and there are so many sites. A lot of them are derelict now, or farmers use them or whatever, and so I've always had a kind of, I suppose, a passion. And where my dad flies from near Diss in Norfolk, that was it Liberators base there, and the actor Jimmy Stewart flew from there. So I have got, I love my aeroplanes. I love my aeroplanes, I do. Okay, so what have you guys got coming up that you want to tell us about?
We've got
St. Cath's.
Yeah, St. Cath's on the 2nd of September.
Anyone would think we planned it that way, wouldn't they?
Yeah,
we could talk about how great it is.
Yep.
It's because we go every month, so we're always at St. Cath's.
Prior to that, there's Scarborough Grand Hotel this Saturday, but that's sold out.
Oh, I love Scarborough.
And then we do Army Mills at Leeds on the 19th, and then Olsham House in Hull on the 26th, and then it's
kind
St. Cath's.
South East, North and West Yorkshire, I think, over the next month.
Yeah,
lovely.
And then we head up to Gainsborough Hall on the 9th, and then it's the St. Breville's.
Yeah, St. Breville's down in Gloucestershire. Our weekend away.
So busy.
Yeah.
Oh, busy, yes.
Good. Well, thank you ever so much, guys, for coming on the show again and for giving me sort of some time off your holiday whilst we're talking. If anyone does want to look up what the lovely Dawsons are doing, you just need to look up Simply Ghost Nights on Facebook and on the internet. I believe you've got a website, Simply Ghost Nights.
We have www.simplyghostnights.co.uk.
Thank you very much, Rosie. And so if anyone wants to have a look up, contact them. They're lovely. They're very easy to chat to, as you can probably tell from the conversations we've been having, and they'll reply to you if you've got any queries. But all that leaves me to say is I hope you've enjoyed tonight's show on St. Catherine's in Doncaster. If you have had any experiences of any of the places we talk about, please do get in contact with me. But all that leaves me to say is have a good evening, sleep tight, and don't be too scared by things that go bump in the night.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.